Arroyo or like Chris all around the world. So can we actually convene policymakers, think tanks, city mayors, city administrators around this subject? Secondly, you know, after connecting, how do we actually co-create knowledge? Because we know today that there are gaps in knowledge, that there are certain areas which need to be actually researched more. So the third C on this global urbanization knowledge platform is that of actually creating new knowledge, and the fourth one is, of course, customizing it to local needs. What worked in Korea, and we heard this afternoon just in the last session about what kind of territorial growth and outward outlook that Korea acquired in order to actually grow, would that actually work in Bogota? Would that work in Johannesburg, or would that work in Mumbai, or are there other cities which could do the same, which have which have exactly the same specific paradigm of development? And so, which are the key four groups that we are looking at? So we are definitely looking at city mayors and as administrators, at NGOs, at CBOs, because these are the groups which actually define an urban policy and take it forward. But as importantly, we are also looking at national governments. And this morning it was said that it's often that national governments do not actually focus on cities. So how many national governments actually put up even a 5-page white paper on their urban policy? I do believe that Colombia has, but there are a number of national governments which are not focusing on their cities as drivers of growth or as drivers of competition at all. So that's one area that we want to bring on this platform. I already talked about institutions like the World Bank and think tanks like Bevis Arroyo and Chris and Center for Livable Cities in Singapore, or Indian Institute for Human Settlement in India, coming together in terms of actually bringing together key knowledge and addressing knowledge gaps. The third one is, of course, the private sector. We talked about how do we involve private sector, especially when we're looking at infrastructure. So we cannot have the private sector out of this loop, because a whole lot of innovation is taking place there. A whole lot of entrepreneurship is coming from the private sector. And of course, we talked about how cities are centers for innovation and entrepreneurship. So in order to harness that, we do need the private sector as much on the table as much we need policymakers, actors, think tanks, and research institutes. There are 4 key areas around which the Urbanization Knowledge Platform is formed. The first one is economic growth, and that was brought many times in the discussion today. And just looking at Colombia itself, we know, and I think we discussed this morning about the urbanization review and the framework that we are looking at how Colombia is urbanizing, that although 75% of Colombia is urbanized and there is amazing population density in its cities, but the economic density is missing. That we don't see as many bumps scattered around the country as we see in terms of cities. So how do we actually move on to making Colombia an economic dense city? We also talked about inter and intra-city transportation and how infrastructure is a key area where we need more investment to take economic growth forward. So that's one area that we're looking at. And of course, we talked about the framework of not just looking at large cities, but looking at the whole framework in terms of systems of cities, because secondary cities are growing faster than metropolitan cities. So how do we actually weave those secondary cities into the whole paradigm of urbanization, and what kind of policies then do we need at the national level and at the regional level to weave in the system of cities? Secondly, we are looking at sustainability. And sustainability is not just about environment, but we are also looking at climate change. And this morning, the minister talked about how disaster risk management is a key area for Colombia, especially in terms of of flooding and El Niños. We've also seen that actually the urban poor are very much at the nexus of adaptation, not so much at mitigation. And that we need to bring urban planning, disaster risk management, and urban poor right into the area of disaster risk management. And of course, climate change and adaptation and mitigation, green growth that we also talked about, and green infrastructure. The third area that we're looking at is inclusiveness, and that's to do with urban poverty. So how do we make our cities more inclusive? How do we create more urban housing, more affordable housing, and how do we get public transport to connect those who are not connected to their jobs and live miles away out of the city center and spend 3 to 4 hours commuting into their work and similarly going back. So that actually addresses, in fact, urban poverty and the question of equity and inclusiveness both. And the fourth area is about governance. We heard this morning about how Medellin actually is looking at a city region, but not so much Bogota. So how do we move into metropolitan planning? How do we get local authorities to think about common issues such as infrastructure and service delivery, and how do they impact growth together? And I know later this afternoon we're going to hear from Bob Yarrow more on this. And then governance. I think it was raised in the audience that, well, we somehow skirted around corruption. So that's another area that cities want to learn from each other. And then if we talk about just inclusive or participatory local government, how do we get communities involved? How do we have participatory budgeting? How do we design intergovernmental fiscal relations and transfers? So really, if we look at 4 key pillars, I think those 4 key pillars were already discussed pretty heavily this morning, and going forward, I know that tomorrow we'll be discussing those as well. And we hope that in the next 2 days that we would actually be taking this discussion further and looking at exactly how this knowledge platform can actually be effective and be useful to you, because it all depends on your participation and what you add to it and what you demand from it. Now, how is this actually going to work? Because it's a bit like eating mist. So you've created a platform, and then what does it do? Or how does it work on a day-to-day basis? So we go. And Austin is going to explain that.